Welcome everyone to this Zoom conversation, a virtual conversation on poetry and geopoetics. Thank you so much to everyone who's managed to join us. We're very much looking forward to a discussion, a conversation between two excellent poets who have both published by Red Squirrel Press, very experienced poets and also organisers and providers of workshops, both outdoors and indoors, over quite a number of years in encouraging and assisting people to and inspiring people to write poetry. So first of all, Helen Boden is going to open the conversation, and Elizabeth Rimmer is going to come in, and they'll have a real conversation about poetry and geopoetics. So welcome everyone, and off we go.
Thank you very much, Nori. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you ever so much for putting the things in the chat. And the chat's going to be saved, I think, afterwards, because we've got a wee bit of a list poem going on there, just with everybody's location. And as Marriott says there, it's not just what you see, it's what you feel, and all the senses, which is a very nice segue into how I'm going to start, which is with a series of quotations about writing and literature that's influenced me, that has some connection with the earth, or might have some perceived connection with geopoetics, though it wouldn't have identified itself as doing that. Then I'm going to read a couple of my own poems and hand over to Elizabeth, who will do similar. And then we're going to talk about some recent, very exciting recent poetic interventions, and see if we can begin to redefine the poetics, the poetry of geopoetics. And we'll finish up by reading and talking about a couple of each other's poems, is the plan. So I'm going to dive straight in and read a quotation, not from a poet actually, but from the sculptor Barbara Hepworth, who happened to go to the same secondary school as I did 70 years before I did. And I do like to bang on about that a bit. It's in one of my poems. Her father was the county surveyor in the West Riding of Yorkshire, and she describes in a note I'll read from a collection of statements that Tate St. Ives has published, an early memory of hers, which resonates a lot with an early memory I had. She says, this is Barbara Hepworth, "All my early memories are of forms and shapes and textures. Moving through and over the West Riding landscape with my father, the hills were sculptures, the roads defined the form. Above all, there was a sensation of moving physically over the contours of fullness and concavities, through hollows and over peaks, feeling, touching, seeing through mind and hand and eye. The sensation has never left me, I, the sculptor, and the landscape." Now that notion of the speaking eye and its history and relationship to things is something Elizabeth's going to say a little bit more about a bit later, and something we hope will build into the discussion, because I think politically it's quite an important thing at the moment. I'm just going to share my screen. Fingers crossed here we got the right one. If I move that. I moved from West Yorkshire, did both my degrees in the English department at Newcastle University, which made much, quite rightly, of its situation in the northeast of England, heritage of Boden, so forth, the Lindisfarne Gospels, and study of Anglo-Saxon was compulsory in the first year. I took it a little bit further, slightly embarrassed here because there are probably people who are better at it than I am. Elizabeth certainly is. She has translations in her collections. This is from what's known as the Exeter Book, which was, I think, 10th, 11th century of earlier poems. So this is early Christian, early literate north of England. I think this is dated to a little bit later than the earliest form because it includes some Norse words, which would have come in about the 7th, 8th century. But I'm going to read this. I have put a kind of loose translation underneath the lines, but I'll read it and invite you just to listen to the sounds and the words without creating meaning for it. And again, apologies for my accent. The Wanderer. Oft he man haie are je biedeth, meer to des milste thathe he moordjärig, jonge lagelade, longe skjolde, reren met hondum, grim kalde sea, waden raklastas, ud bithful arid. Swak wath the eerstapper, je fether je mundig, rath the veil slater, vinimaga hera. And then it goes on to the Wanderer's own monologue. Just picking out a couple of words there. Moordkjærig, I've translated as anxious, mind caring, eerstapper, wanderer, earthstepper, that sense of coinage and the literality of the language. As in Anglo-Saxon poetry, you have half lines that alliterate here. Welsh poetry, Gaelic poetry has its own traditions. We'll talk a little bit about that a bit later maybe, but coming out the screen share now. Excuse me. I guess that was one of the earliest things that made me think about land and poetry, and out of that more modern poetry where meaning and accent and rhythm is important, like Gerard Manley Hopkins and the Windhover, you know, I caught this morning, morning's minion, kingdom of daylight, Dauphin, dapple dawn, drawn falcon in his riding of the rolling level, underneath him steady air and off, etc. But I came to specialize in what was known as the Romantic period, 18th and 19th century poetry, and self-representation and autobiography. So focusing particularly on early manuscripts of Wordsworth's The Prelude, but also John Clare. I'm not going to read a quotation from Clare at the moment, but absolutely commend his autobiographical writings. I think Clare is the poet of that period who's been held to have the greatest geopoetic sensibility, but there's also he also has some fabulous autobiographical writings. We've created a bibliography. We'd have to say it's a very subjective bibliography because we're just picking on our own interests and not really aiming to be completely comprehensive here, but that's in there. And at the same time as this, women's poetry anthologies started to become much more available. Women's poetry from earlier periods taught on university syllabuses, often with an interesting relationship to place themselves. So a couple mentioned here will be Charlotte Smith, who writes sonnets in what might be seen quite a masculine tradition about place and relationship to it, but I think has a slightly different slant. And Joanna Bailey, born in Bothwell in South Lanarkshire, who had long poems called A Winter's Day and a Summer's Day, which look at the labourer's perspective and the working day of farm labourers and on the land, rather from that top-down perspective. Same time, I was discovering Scottish poetry of place, particularly Norman MacLeod, Sorley MacLean in translation, Kathleen Jamie, and writers who could be seen as contemporaries of Kenneth White, practicing and experimenting and innovating in Scottish poetry. So we've got Edwin Morgan, Ian Hamilton Finlay, Richard Long, working with visual art as well, Thomas A. Clarke, development of concrete poetry and using text and text as image in Scottish poetry. My own route to geopoetics was, I think, gradually by amassing things like that and finding a common interest in them. But I remember once listening to Peter Maxwell Davies talking on the radio about composing on the beaches of Sanday in an embodied, full sensory 3D experience, and then coming to transcribe it into musical annotation. And that's somehow that way of mediating or representing place in an art form. And about the same time, I went to a Geopoetics Scotland event at the Radical Book Fair at Edinburgh and had a chat with Norrie for the first time. I had visual artist friends who were involved and had been on residentials. And so I started attending events and residentials, sometimes facilitating workshops and gathering the perspectives and passions and experience of others from a wide range of disciplines and interests and places as we have here tonight. And I was pleased to be in the geo-identity section of this book, which was published last year, Geopoetry and Geopoetics, by the Edinburgh Geological Society, because I think that's probably where I see myself in terms of thinking about identity. And just before I hand over to Elizabeth to do her introduction, I'm just going to read a couple of poems from my own collection, which is called A Landscape to Figure In, and looks at place and identity in relation to my own and to others' experience in the present and the past, and the way place is represented in visual art or coded in maps and signs and language, and looks at the human history of place use. So there are poems about the Covenanters, the Clearances, Wilfred Owen's stay at Craig Lockett, and this poem, which is called Valleytown. If I share my screen again, I'll just read a couple of poems from this collection. So this is a poem I wrote in Galashiels, but it could equally be about the former mill towns in the West Riding of Yorkshire or the Welsh Valleys. I'm quite interested in hybrid and fictive locations rather than accurate ones. So Valleytown. Streets lineate the hillside, terrace above the A road and river, houses built for workers in whatever line went on because of the watercourse and caused the arterial road. Look down on industries, light inheritors of the valley bottom, car parks, units, retail parks. Millennial development has improved on flats put up on the hill in the 60s, balconies with better prospects, wood, glass walkways that bridge the slope. The cemetery at the end of the one bisecting lane is halfway up onto the moor that keeps the town at bay, that rebuffs by night, mill shop, golf course, holiday home, the shadow of the valley, that is darker than the unpolluted sky. That's the first poem in the collection. There's a link which I'll put in the chat to the book and to Elizabeth's collections. And I'll finish off this section with the final poem, which is also quite hybrid and fictive in its locations, but it's called Har, St. Michael and All Angels. Ground is air, is earth, is mist, is soil, is light, is loam, is haze, is breath, is foot, is voice, is long, is home to their remains, their flesh made word beneath names and dates fixed on York stone. I shall stop my share there and hand over to Elizabeth.
Thanks, Helen. My intro into geopoetics is a lot less academic, although I did do English at Liverpool, and then I did an MLit in Stirling on medieval literature. But my big concern was writing, and originally I was writing fantasy literature because The Lord of the Rings came out in paperback when I was 14, so inevitably. one thing I realized very quickly was if you were going to write a fantasy, you had to ground it very carefully in a landscape, because you can't just have random. You need something to hang on to. So I got quite interested in landscape and how it affects your story and all that sort of thing. Then I wrote, when I was a teenager, I wrote poetry, I wrote fiction, then I stopped. Then I did my research degree and got interested in the mystical writers, which meant I got interested in a lot of the more contemplative tradition. And then I stopped again. And then in 1994, I was mopping the kitchen floor and listening to Ian Anderson, who had a program at that time called Mr. Anderson's Fine Tunes. And he had an interview with Kenneth White, whose Handbook of the Diamond Country and the Bird Path were just about to be brought out. And then this happened. I've moved this one. High blue day on Scalpe. This is the summit of contemplation, and no art can touch it. Blue, so blue, that far out archipelago in the sea, shimmering, shimmering, no art can touch it. The mind can only try to become attuned to it, to become quiet and space itself out, to become open and still, unworlded, knowing itself in the diamond country, in the ultimate unlettered light. And that was amazing. I went down to the library, I found Bird Path, I found Handbook of the Diamond Country, I started reading, and I discovered that Kenneth White had also tangled with a lot of the Celtic poetry and stuff that I had been reading when I was writing fantasy. In particular, I think he references this, I don't think he cites it, but there's a bit where he's talking about Celtic poetry, and you think this is quite similar in feeling. Now, this translation is by Lady Gregory from Gods and Fighting Men, and it doesn't have a tremendous reputation now. It's not scholarly, it's quite lyrical, but it has a really interesting concept. This is Finn's first poem about the coming of summer. "'Tis the month of May, is the pleasant time. Its face is beautiful. The blackbird sings his full song. The living wood is his holding. The cuckoos are singing and ever singing. There is welcome here before the brightness of the summer. Summer is lessening the rivers. The swift horses are looking for the pool. The heath spreads out its long hair. The weak white bog down grows. A wildness comes on the heart of the deer. The sad, restless sea is asleep." There's a lot more, as you can see, it goes on a bit, but the point of that story is that the gift of poetry is to be in conversation with what's happening in the world, with the wind and the water and the weather and the birds and the animals, and how your fellow men are responding, or the activities of the summer, how your community works. And I thought, this is the good stuff. I'm going to read a poem later on called Hooper Swans, which is about that. Oh, I've lost the plot. I really have. I have completely forgotten where I was going to go. Anyhow, the thing is that having got all excited and responding to all the worlds that Kenneth White's travel books were opening up, I started writing again, and I started writing a lot of environmental poetry. The other thing that was happening as I was growing up was the energy crisis. And you suddenly realized how much the Western economy was depending on oil and how badly we were handling it. So I got quite environmentally aware. And in 2007, there was an initiative called Live Simply, I think, in church. And I had a project called Luca, which was mixing environmental awareness and environment and activism and artistic expression, because I reckoned that you wouldn't take care of anything that you didn't love, and you wouldn't love it if you didn't see it and appreciate it and wonder what was going on. And I blogged about it a lot, and I shared poets and painters and all sorts of stuff. And then Norrie got in touch and said, are you interested in the Scottish Centre for Geopoetics? And I went to the Atlantic Island Festival on Ling, which was 2009. As part of that setup, I met Peter Erpeth, who said, oh, you are ready to start sending the poetry out. And I did. I sent it to Sheila Wakefield, and the rest is history. Since then, I was on the council for a while. I edited a couple of issues of Straveg, and I was involved in Expressing the Earth in 2017, which was an amazing, exhausting, multifaceted geopoetical experience that I don't think we'll ever top, because I don't think any of us have got the stamina. And since then I've been editing. Now, because of the particular slant of my own work, I have become aware of a lot of other writers who have also got into environmental writing and eco-poetry and stuff, and I became aware that there is a lot more going on than there used to be. I have completely blanked. I can't remember what we were doing next. Help.
Shall I come in and talk about a couple of contemporary examples, or do you want to carry on and do that just now?
Well, I could, because I'm thinking I was going to follow up Lady Gregory with Sean Hewitt, who is
do that.
a contemporary writer who has translated but adapted an old Irish poem called Sweeney Astray. It still has the very detailed geographical observation, but the emotional environment is very different. No matter, hang on, I need to share this screen. No matter where I go, my sins follow. First, the starry frost will fall at night into every pool, and me left out in it, straying on the mountain. And then the herons will be crying in the cold of Glenagle, and the flocks of birds will be leaving overhead. I live with the frost, sleep in its bed, have for pillow the rough wind-driven snow, and when the skylarks come, I hide from them, shaking, shelter by a single oak, till the weak sun kindles and I must stumble again from the old treetop and leave once more by the deer paths over the red field. Yeah. Okay, Helen, I'll hand over to you now while I get back on track.
Can't hear you, Helen. Are you still there with us?
Oh,
Many apologies. Yeah, still forget how to unmute. Many apologies. I'm going to start talking about a couple of contemporary examples in a minute of poets who are taking quite intersectional approaches now. So looking, for example, at the importance of the body, disability, neurodiversity, Polly Atkins' collection, Much with Body, which I'm not going to read from, deals with disability and has wonderful found poetry from Dorothy Wordsworth's journals that makes a sequence in the middle of the book. The first book I'm going to talk about is Kate Davis, The Girl Who Forgets How to Walk. And one of the things I've noticed here is there are quite a number of publishers who are publishing work at the moment that has an affinity with geopoetics, and penned in the margins, the publisher of this is one of them who's doing that. So I'm just going to share my screen for a second again. Down there. So this is a page from Kate Davis's book, which I'm not going to read from, but it points up again the linguistic and the formal experiment that I think quite a lot of poets are doing now, which I think can be traced back to modernism and postmodernism, very use of fount text, a use in this case of exploded text here on the right-hand page to suggest fragmentation of the body, of personality, of the ecological crisis. And there are a number of poets doing this very well now, and I'll mention a couple more. I think I'll just leave that there for you to look at. About a third of Kate Davis's book, The Girl Who Forgets How to Walk, is actually an extended sequence about a girl, a young girl who gets polio, forgets how to walk, and is rehabilitated using extended geological metaphors. Davis is from the Furness Peninsula in Cumbria, and as an aside here, I'd add that one of my interests is actually similarities between the north of England and the south of Scotland, linguistically, topographically, culturally. I think they have a lot more in common with each other than is sometimes held. And I think the sort of greater fault lines lie between lowland and highland Scotland, literally with the Highland fault, and between the north and south of England. But I think that's also quite a movable boundary, because where do you put it? I'm not suggesting anything politically here, but I think it's exciting writing coming out of the north of England and out of Scotland at the minute. And Kate Davis was a writer I was interested to discover a while back. And I'm going to read a short poem by hers in a moment. But what I'm first going to do is just read out the subtitles of the poems that form the Girl Who Forgets How to Walk sequence, because I think they give you, it sort of becomes a poem in itself. I'm clearly creating something false here, but it gives a sense of the autobiography, the sense of person and body, and also how the geology is used with it. So The Girl Who Forgets How to Walk. First poem, How the Forgetting Begun. The hot, terrible dawn, the cot in the isolation hospital, the complete mechanism of the post-infectious child, the refusal to wear calipers and orthopedic boots. During periods of immobility, she studied the Ladybird Book of British Wildflowers. the Ethel Headley Hospital for Crippled Children. Avoir du poids, 11 plus. Song for myself, if you notice that difference there from Walt Whitman's Song of Myself, and we're going to come back, I think, to this speaking I. Song for myself, fixed, these shoes, the dream again, boulder drift, pattern spell, rain. She comes up with a way to cope with the cold of it. She examines her fear that the ground is not to be trusted, and unstable earth ground is a common theme of her poems. Handwriting practice, geology. She teaches herself to walk across a limestone landscape. Dream. So those are the subtitles of the sequence. And I'll read a short poem by Kate Davis called Erosion, which for me simply but very beautifully builds a geological metaphor to talk about dysfunctional family. Erosion. The new brother was chalk. His small chest squeezed so hard, he crumpled before our eyes. One sister was getting paler and lighter each day until she was grey pumice, floating to a fair archipelago. Another had become confusing as runes. Our was a stony outcrop. Father, a cobble chucked into a pond and sunk. I'll mention two collections that have been very important to me this year. I've noticed the author of one of them who's in the audience, but I was going to say this anyway. I'll stop my share there. These are Bridget Kersheed's The Last Days of Petrol and Stuart Sanderson's The Sleep Road. And I'll mention these because I've got quite a detailed review forthcoming from them in Northwards Now, which should be out any minute. But absolutely wonderful and quite different ways of dealing with the environmental crisis and emergency, and using poetic form to talk about place in different ways. So look at those books by Tapsell Thierry and Shearsman, also publishers, along with our own publisher, Ret Squirrel Press, who promote a lot of environmental and geopoetic work. The other thing I'm going to mention in this section in some more detail when I find my, I'm reading here, my notes are on a PowerPoint, which I'm not screen sharing, and then some of the things so that I can read that and look at the camera, and the things I am reading out are separately on a Word document. So that's the body disability perspective. Also mentioned Jen Hatfield's book, The Stone Age, which deals with neurodiversity. For the most part, I'm focusing on small and independent presses because I think they're a hugely important part of the poetry, ecology and environmental writing, but Hatfield's published with Picador, and some of the big publishing houses are also producing amazing work. But the same thing I want to mention here is I think it's pretty impossible to talk about poetry of place in an age when so many people are displaced without thinking about migration. And you can think about human migration, you can use metaphor of a bird and animal migration. My own book has a few poems about migration in various ways, internal migration, bird migration. But I think more important than those is the experience of Black and peoples of colour, and the post-colonial ecological experience in writing, of which, again, much more is available. And the book I'm going to mention second here is by Alicia P. Mohammed, called Hinge, and published by Ignition Press from Oxford Brookes University. P. Mohammed is a Canadian national living and working in Scotland. I think her parents were from Tanzania, and she references Kuchi and Gujarati in her book. And I'm just going to read the first poem from this collection, from this pamphlet. She's got a full collection coming out with Polygon very soon, which I think just pulls a lot of these ideas together very, very beautifully. The idea about the body, colonialism, migration, and the use of language. This poem is called My body is a forest. There's a face in the trees. I lost a language to the gap-toothed birch. Even the pine has learned how to swoon when the wind deposits a secret. A country is born knowing what it means to waver. A lost country is made by its daughters, and shame begins as a seed that blossoms perennially through generations. Clove keeps the char bitter. For every dark cross, I apologize, because I could not read the script. I could not read the recipe written in my grandmother's neat script. I added cinnamon, crushed anise, mountain slope, and too many quartered Canadas. Once I watched a mule deer enfold her limbs and vanish among haloed trees, fog uncoiling at her heels, a ghost inviting her into its loosened borders. In the blood of every migrant, there is a map pointing home. This body is an ode to the scattered landscapes that have marbled my neck with dark hairs and sharp, coarse longings. Ask me how I remember her, not a face, but a movement, legs stotting into a slip of boreal green, a swatch of colour in the shape of a lost country, a daughter, which is to say, an inherited vanishing through the slit of a dream. And just up into my screen share there again. There's a reference which I'll put in the chat to Alicia Feather-Hermot's page on the IASH, Edinburgh Institute of Advanced Studies, in the arts page. And she asks there who gets to call themselves a nature poet, whose bodies have perceived access to natural spaces, which I think is an interesting thing and an important thing to think about here, as there are poets, writers of colour, queer writers, disabled writers. I think that's probably all I want to say at the moment, other than that the ways in which all these writers are using experimental form and layouts, I think is actually very exciting to read and to listen to and to look at on the page. And one thing to mention in this section before I forget, I'm not going to read from it, but Lynn Valentine's pamphlet, A Glimmer of Stars, interestingly presents a parallel text between Angus Scott's and her own English translation. So the Angus Scott's is on the left-hand page and the English translations. And that's a lovely moving between a Scots dialect, which may not be familiar as things like Doric or Glasgow or East Coast Scots are to many of us. And yeah, I'll stop my screen share there and hand back to Elizabeth, I think.
Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about access to land or to nature or to country and migration. I wanted to mention two poets. One is Kai Miller, who is from Jamaica, and he's got a book called In Nearby Bushes. And he has a lot of poems about colonialism and about people being where they are because they were put where they are and where they don't belong, and how they make a new life in a new landscape. And the other one is an Inuit poet called Josephine Bacon, who writes a lot about being moved out of the country. And this is a poem which you can see now in the Voice of the Wind, I think. Someone seems to be calling me to the woods there in the back country, our country. It's been so long since I saw the Innu pass by on sleds, he seems to be saying. Where have the Innu gone? And it seems this is something that people in Scotland could identify with the clearances. But it's a voice that we don't hear quite often. The voice of people who can't have access to land because they've been shifted off. And the Inuit community in particular suffers greatly from forced displacement and the loss of their culture. And the other thing that came to mind only this morning, because I saw there's a poet called Jo Clement who has a book called Outlandish coming out absolutely today. And she is of Romany. When geopoeticians talk about the intellectual nomad, I think it might be quite salutary to think about the experiences of actual nomads. There are quite a few traveller poets now. David Morley is the most conspicuous, and I was going to talk about him earlier on when I was talking about grounding in knowledge of the world, you know, accurate and detailed and real deep awareness, because he was also a biologist, and a lot of his poems are very, very learned indeed. The other thing I was going to talk about was language, and language as it expresses purpose. One of the poems I picked from Helen's to talk about is an illustration of this, but I was looking for a balance to the Irish poet, and I came across the Song of Bendoran by Duncan Van McIntyre, and that is quite a very different. When he talks about the stags roaring in the summertime, he has a purpose. He is going to be stalking those stags. His awareness of the landscape is very much focused on his profession. And it was something I came across when I was a low carbon conference in Stirling. There's a woman in Orkney who is very much involved in renewables and trying to persuade people to have these wave generators. And she was describing how far your intention and your purpose shapes your observation of the language. And you can see this in the poetry. So I'm going to move straight on to Helen's poem, which I will find. No, it's further up. Which is called Fluent. And I'm going to have to apologize because there's Polish in here, and I know there's at least one Polish speaker watching, and I'm just going to skip this Polish, but you'll be able to see it. Light ripples dark lines of calligraphy onto waves at Clubby. It looks to us like Arabic. Messages flow by, replaced by a similar script saying something else while the original moves on, a syllable less, a sound compressed, towards the angler's caravan on the man-made bank. While light remains the same and wind is constant, the meniscus repeats its hand, redraft. Water levels low, cloud levels may vary, return all brown trout. By the time we've finished eating snacks, the words have merged into something like a moving typeface. When we try to decipher this freshwater autocue, we can only come up with an aquatic transcription of the imperatives tacked to the boundary fence. And here is the Polish stuff. So, Olga, if you unmute, could you read it?
I'm holding up the English translation. I'm not prepared to read the Polish.
We asked the man at the caravan if he can tell us what the notices say. He explains about confusion between subsistence and sport and offers to put the kettle on. After some riffing on recently changed implications, wider insinuations, the small print messages getting across, I revert to wondering if the wind dictates the words or reads what's relayed up from mass and weight of water underneath. There's an arbitrary sign of atmospheric mood, no projection of ours at all. The way you can see the phrenology of tide in the marks it leaves in sand, on warps and folds in weathered rocks remain as pattern, contour lines, a relief map of its own terrain. And there's the translation, fishing prohibited, private land. It does remind me of an incident when I was at Stirling. One of the students came in and said, they've given us a lot of bother. They really didn't mind the Welsh students snaring the rabbits, but they took exception to us stealing the ducks. And you realise that what was an ornamental aspect of a rather pretty lake to most people was food. So these particular students, right. We have rambled on a bit, haven't we? Do we want to read our poems now? And then cut to...
Well, I was just going to say one final thing and then read a poem of yours, and then we have the two voice thing to finish off with. So I think that will just take a couple of minutes. So I think I wanted to ask people the question to think about while we're reading the final couple of poems of what can poetry of the earth or place do in a time of displacement and crisis or trauma. From my perspective, it sort of has the choices of offering witness or polemic, or working with sound and rhythm, which can be quite healing in itself. Elizabeth has got charms in some of her verse. One of the things I go back to actually is Kathleen Rain's Spell Against Sorrow, which is a song that kind of goes through all the elements and then has words, spell away, tell away sorrow, carry away grief. The cadences of Scots, Doric, Shetlandic, of Gaelic, closeness to song and the ballad tradition, I think all has something very primal that connects with the rhythms of life and bodily experience, connection with the mother maybe, that can be a healing and consoling thing. I'd say that just very literally, I'm not very well myself at the moment, and I have actually been trying to practice what I preach, as in reading poetry, reading out loud, going for walks, and that's a better place to be than my head is at the moment. I'm going to screen share a final time and read a poem of Elizabeth's that I particularly like. Only it doesn't seem to, excuse me, sorry. This had to happen at some point. Try this again. If not, I'll just read it from the book. It's gone. It's called Lost Roads, and I like this because it just pulls together so many different things. I am haunted by wet places, the lure of rivers, reed beds and green lands of ash and willow, the drift of water pooling between autumn stems and wind-frayed rags of common sedge and reed is like the course of blood, of thought deep in the mulch of me. There is talk of lost roads, broad walks, of planks and narrow handrails hid deep beneath the quaking ground, with its stealth of buntings, stepping heron, its shattered tops of bulrush, spilling cottony seed like spill cockney seed for birds like new coins at a wedding scramble. The hidden past with its myth of Romans and lost queens, of the Iron Age, threads its careful way through the thickets of imagined story, and I, not immune to this casual appropriation, imprint my own lost ancestors, finding or inventing the feel of home here, roots where there may be none, whole trees growing into the open wind and sky. The way that poem compounds and compresses, detailed, deep mapping, the water alluvial element. I just love the way that sort of flows through that. And shall we finish by reading the Ragnarok poem, Elizabeth?
Okay.
I need to find it. I'll read it. I'll stop my screen share there and just read it from the book, I think, unless you've got the text to hand.
It's on here. There we are.
It's too small. I'll read from the
Lines
book.
in italics are a translation from a Old Norse Edda called Völuspá.
Ragnarok. The wise woman will see all happening again.
In this worldwide battle with everything that hates us, we wallow in the sea, drowning, cast up on the shore of God, which is neither light nor refuge.
The wise woman will see all happening again.
We hear the ragged voices judging, denouncing, afraid, lamenting, afraid, afraid. A wild wind blowing, only wet rock beneath our feet.
Earth again rising, green from the sea, waterfalls in the hills, and an eagle in flight.
Perhaps in the morning we will take up our tools, learn to console, redress. Perhaps we will remember the lost work, lost words.
Wonder of wonders, they will find in the grass the gold chess pieces that used to be theirs.
Buried skills, lost faith in kindness might emerge in gifts of comfort, laughter, the company of friends, again, again, again.
It will happen that fields will spring without sowing, all ills will be healed, hope will come back. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Helen and Elizabeth. I see a comment there from Joyce Gilbert about the importance of touching people's hearts and the musical element in modern poetry. And I personally have found this array of poems that have been read to us tonight by Helen and Elizabeth. I believe that they have touched my heart tonight. So I hope you've had the same experience. I think it's been a wonderful aspect of tonight's presentations and conversations that we've heard so many wonderful poems. We've heard them as well as being able to read most of them. So I'm now going to open up for questions and comments from anyone who would like to join in.
Can I answer that point too, that I think, and I would actually offer Stuart Sanderson's book, The Sleep Road, as an example of this, of poems that are using the musical element and not using it. So found poetry very often doesn't, because it's constructing things from different sources, and the point is that it's not lyrical always. But also there's tremendous use in here of formal verse. There's octava rima, the form that Byron used there's kind of ballad forms. So I think the musicality is really important, but what's exciting for me is how it can exist alongside a kind of sparser, more experimental form, where the musical cadences aren't the important thing. And I just think there's an amazing range addressing geopoetic and environmental themes at the moment. But yeah, the music of poetry remains hugely important. Sorry.
I agree with that. I always read aloud before I send anything off. I think that the way it sounds is really important.
Yep.
But it's a different thing from, for instance, performance poetry, which has a lot of different skills, but yeah,
Yep.
It is music. I'm sure, because I used to be a folk singer, I'm sure that that shaped the way I write, because, you know, you hear the beat. I notice it with people I'm editing too. You know, there are some people with very classical skills. There was at least one who was pretty much freeform jazz. Some of them marches, some dances. It's very interesting to see how people handle it.
Are there other questions or comments that anyone would like to make? I see a cry for help from Colin Will.
Yeah. Yes, Norrie, it's just that I am connected to the lands of the Picts by my DNA and by my family history. And I don't know how to express myself when I go there. I feel at home there, but I feel at home in a lot of other places too. But it's just that I want to describe what I'm feeling, and I haven't got the language to do it. The closest I can come is Doric, but that's a variant of Scots, and it's not the same as what it would have been to the people who lived there at the time. So it's a strange feeling not having a native tongue, if you like, because I feel Pictish, if anything, would be my native tongue if it existed.
Yeah.
I think the Cornish people must have felt the same, but Cornish looks as if it's being kind of reverse engineered.
Yeah, Kerniwick, it's coming back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm also thinking about experiments by people like M. Strang, who are kind of creating a vocabulary and a soundscape for something that is not an articulate language as well, it's very articulate, but it's, I guess it's an attempt at mimesis or representation or something, which isn't quite what you're saying, Colin, but I think all the finding the right language for what you have to say and for your roots and what you're connected with, I think is the problem or challenge that we're all facing.
Yeah, there is a language that I do have from my training as a geologist. So that I can talk about the rocks and the mountains and the processes that have made things the way they are or make things change. And I'm happy with that. That is a language that I have used in poetry. But it's the mother tongue, if you like. I don't know which is my mother tongue.
You're going to talk to John Bolland, who is writing a whole trilogy of stuff about the landscapes of the Deveron Valley. Yeah. And he's got all sorts of languages in it, and he's writing quantum physics in Doric, which is the weirdest thing you've ever seen. But it is exactly about that. It's how you represent various areas of experience and which languages and which range of sounds and which resonances go with which. It's going to be an amazing thing if he gets it done.
I would look forward to that, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Can I take up one of the points that you made towards the end? I'm not sure it was Helen or Elizabeth or both of you. You referred to the way in which more and more poets are coming into the field of geopoetics and are writing in their own ways about the earth. Geopoetics is the creative expression of the earth in all kinds of media. And one of the things that I've found over the years is that visual artists very much recognize what geopoetics is about, because they always tell me when they first hear the term and they read a little bit about it, or they come to a talk or something, they always say, oh yeah, well, that's what I've been doing for years.
Yeah.
And I think it's very encouraging that we're a growing influence in poetry and in the arts and sciences and bringing all these together. One thing I think that does inspire people is it presents a vision which can encourage folk to keep being active in trying to limit the damage that humans are doing to the earth, or that capitalism is doing to the earth, perhaps more precisely. So I wonder if you either of you could say a little bit about what you think geopoetics might be able to offer people who are coming to it fairly new, and where might it go in the future?
Well, I was at, I think, annual general meeting of the Friends of the Occults, and they are really trying to prevent overdevelopment and especially overforestation of there. And they were saying, oh, but we don't have enough poets to, I'm thinking, not only are there several poets, there are several in this audience. So, but the thing that surprised me was one of the handicaps to them was there wasn't anybody that had put up a kind of monument or flown a flag for them to rally around, and they thought the poets really needed to do that. I think there's a lot in that. I mean, the trouble is we've got some very worn out and hackneyed models of that. You don't want Bonnie Glens and and nostalgia. But actual poetry, something that will attract attention maybe to things that you've taken for granted, so that you see, you walk down the road and you get a glimpse of a tree at the bend of the road, and you think, I've never seen that tree like that. Now, whenever I look at it, I'll see it. I think that's something that poetry can really do.
Helen?
Brian McManus had just put an interesting comment in the chat about a psychogeographical thread running through it. And I think I'm interested here in the cross currents between psychogeography and eco-poetry and geopoetry. And I'm not sure all the poets I read would actually define themselves or think of themselves as being practicing geopoetic. They are. So I think what excites me really is the broadness of the church. And, if you kind of go to festivals like Stanza, put the new Push the Boat Out one in Edinburgh, a lot of the other poetry festivals like Ledbury, Aldeburgh have things available online, and just kind of see who's reading there, and, and who's publishing them and what connections are coming out. Elizabeth mentioned John Boland's newer work a minute ago. I'll just flag up his, again, Red Squirrel Press, which is one of those poems, Sequences of Witness, in which he's using lived experience of being an offshore engineer at the time of the Piper Alpha disaster, and combining the discourse of that with climate change and emergency. And there are a kind of discourse structure analysis diagrams. I don't know if I can well, there are musical transcriptions and there's kind of assessment of data, and he's putting all that into poetic form, which I think all of this is contributing somehow to broadening the appeal and the number of readers that are, because there'll be people reading this who may not have come, and other things people are doing who may not have come to poetry before.
Yeah, I gave a talk a couple of years ago about ecopoetics and geopoetics, and I'm writing a bit about that in the book I'm working on, a creative non-fiction book about my involvement in geopoetics over many years. One of the significant aspects there is that some of the sort of very well-established poets have reacted very negatively towards Kenneth White in his work, and towards, or maybe not even reacted negatively, they've kind of pretended it doesn't happen. they don't, I'm thinking of John Burnside's A Poet's Polemic pamphlet, which came out, I think, in the early 90s, and Robert Crawford's idea of biopoetics, which I attended a session on, which was basically scientists responding to poets and vice versa. But I think it's significant that when you read their work, they just do not mention geopoetics, even though it's been around since at least 1989. So I think it's a sort of, if you keep silent about it, it might go away, or people might, and instead of taking it on if they disagree with it in some way. So it's a bit of a controversial issue to bring up at this stage of the meeting, but it's something I've come across for quite a few years.
Norman, can I ask a question?
Sorry, yeah. Cool.
First of all, just say how wonderful. It's just such a lovely way to end the working day, by poetry and thinking about the earth and all that needs to be done, etc. So my question is slightly facetious, but it's also, I'm curious. I really enjoyed this afternoon, but I was wondering, if the gender balance had been different, if it had been one man, one woman, or two men, would we have had different subjects or different slants or different perspectives? Now, I know that's kind of how long is a piece of string question, but it just struck me listening to the female voices. Was there something that, did that influence the presentation in some way?
Good point.
Well, I was, when I started putting together the bibliography, I really wanted a lot of women's voices.
Yeah.
Because as far as I know, Kenneth White never referenced a woman writer anywhere, ever. The only time women appear in his books, they're not very flattering. And I thought, hang on, there are a lot of women very active in this scene. We need to have them visible. But of course, then we thought, but we need to make sure we have other people represented. And we have queer people, we have people of colour, we do have men.
Yes.
There are men on that list.
Yes, there are.
But it struck me that a lot of the most interesting things were being done by women because the men have done their thing and we've read it.
They have been heard. Yeah.
That might be a bit contentious and unfair, because John Bollins is going to be completely new and innovative and amazing, but the men have done their thing. So if you want something different, you have to ask women.
Yeah, I think we'd made a conscious choice to, and possibly because it reflects our own reading, but I would kind of say that men poets I know working now, are teaching women poets on the syllabus as much. Maybe not. I mean, I haven't done the stats here, and I know there's still a lot of work to do. But I think a lot of men writing eco-poetry, geopoetry now are actually very aware of gender in that.
Yeah. No, it's a good question. I agree, Marit. Yeah, the way I don't know why it's worked this way, but it's tended to the conversations we've had have tended to be either between two men or two women. and the next one coming up is on geology and geopoetics, and it's Pat Corbett and John Gordon, and their session is now going to be Thursday, the 11th of August at 5 o'clock. So I think you're right. It does sort of influence the kind of discussion that we have and the choice of poets and poetry that we choose and other writings that we choose. I'm hoping that we did make a change at our AGM. We've got now 5 women on the Geopoetics Council, which was great that we got more volunteers to get involved. So I'm hopeful that that maybe the next director of the Scottish Centre for Geopoetics will be a woman, and that will really take things forward that way. You never know.
Can I just come back to Merit's point a minute there? I think something I mentioned at the beginning, and something Elizabeth and I had talked about, because we've had lovely conversations on Zoom planning this, and it just kind of exploded. As you can see, we've got far too much stuff, and we still feel we haven't copied things. But we came down to that notion of the lyric eye, which has its grounding in, Norrie mentioned Walt Whitman as maybe some kind of proto-figure in geopoetics, the Song of Myself. And I was very aware when I was studying English at university in the 80s, I was very unaware of that privileged position of the white male middle class eye. And then all these women's poetry anthologies came, and post-colonial studies and gender studies and things, and that was fabulous. But I think it's that speaking eye. Elizabeth actually had a line about appropriation in the poem of hers that I read out. We're still, was it Kathleen Jamie was talking about the lone enraptured male, the Robert Macfarlane type. And I love Robert Macfarlane's books also, I have to say, and they've taught me a lot. So I think that subject position, the speaking eye, has been used by writers of colour, working class writers. You think back to John Clare again, the famous I Am poem, Audre Lorde's work, a lot of black writers, marginalised writers who've been marginalised, having that assertive eye to convey their own experience and the validity of that, but it's still I in the English language and can maybe be confused with the patriarchal I. So, that's something I'm really interested in looking at. There are also poems, to go to the ecological perspective, that don't have a speaking I human subject. Which I also find quite interesting. And, can you keep I'm actually going to mention a male poet, Richard Skelton here, who's kind of got a sequence that's talking about, taking out the anthropocentric, however gendered. So I think there's lots of work to do around that, and to be aware when we're composing and writing. I'm sure you're aware also as an academic writing critical work that there, parallel things going on there with academics, and you're speaking and writing and critical voice in relation to your subject matter.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks ever so much for that, and all the comments actually, which I'm going to save the chat afterwards and have a look at those because questions.
On that point, we will be saving the chat, and we will send it out from Eventbrite to everyone who has registered for tonight's session. And we will also, once there's been some time to edit tonight's recording, that will be sent out to everyone probably in a later email via Eventbrite. So if you've not managed to, if you came in a bit late or you weren't able to access tonight's session, it will be available, as will the bibliography, which it's a massive bibliography that Helen and Elizabeth have put together for us. And
we keep adding to it.
You know, it's a work in progress, so take it and find your own connections.
great.
Catherine had got a question or a comment there about events in which poetry is shared, and I think Zoom can be a magical thing for poetry, you know, unlike for business meetings when it can be quite dire. I've been to book launches and readings where poetry really sings. Catherine mentions outside, and I'd like to mention one of my favorite collections here. I'm trying to find it. Oh, here we are. Alice Oswalt's Falling Awake, and she has a sequence designed to be read during the dawn at midsummer at the end of this book, called Tithonus, 45 minutes in the life of the dawn. I read this every year around midsummer, and would just say, you know, that's a lovely thing to do. Read outside, read to join with friends, or, you know, just read when you're out on a walk or something. Poetry's everywhere.
Yeah. Well, unless anyone is desperate to ask a further question, I think we should wrap up at this point, if that's okay.
Yeah, well,
that bibliography will be shared. Is that right, Elizabeth and Helen? You'll we can send that out.
Sent it to you, and you can send it to everybody if you'd like to.
I'll attach it to the Eventbrite or a separate email. Yeah. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for attending tonight and taking part in this session. I've enjoyed it. I hope you have too. And I've found it inspiring. And there are lots of things to follow up, poets and books that were mentioned. I hope it might inspire some of you to join the Scottish Centre for Geopoetics. It is a broad church and becoming more of a broad church than it ever was. So I think it's the points that Marit raised and that Helen and Elizabeth made are well made, that we want to have as broad a representation of people involved and contributing as possible. One of the ways you can contribute, of course, is by sending in your poetry or your essays and your images or photographs for our Strabeg or journal, which normally comes out once a year, but it's now looking like twice a year, I'm pleased to say. So you can find out more on our website, www.geopoetics.org.uk, and we'll be following tonight. Yeah.
Can I raise something about the website? Because whenever I try to log in, it tells me it's unsafe because you don't have a security certificate.
Yeah.
So it may be that people are not finding it easy to access.
Good point. Well, you'll be pleased to know that Alison Rowe, who's been a member for quite a few years, she is going to, she's helping already to upgrade the website, and we're going to create a new theme when we get a break in the next month or two. So it's going to take on a new look, and she made that point. It does say not secure, and so the new website will become secure. It'll have a sort of intro HTTPS rather than HTTP. And so if you know what that means.
Yeah.
So yeah, good point. And it is in hand, I can assure you. We've been working on this for a few weeks now, And it's just been the range of things that I'm involved in at the moment that's held us back from that. If you have any high quality, high res photographs that you think would help to make the Geopoetics website more attractive, please send them to me and I'll forward them to Alison. She's asked for that specifically to include. We have saved all the material that's on the current website, so we hope not to lose anything. But so that's a good point, well made, Elizabeth, and one that we want to improve on, definitely. So with that, I'm going to dash over to the Atlantic Island Centre for their meeting about trying to save the future of Ling Primary School. And I hope you can, some of you and maybe all of you can join us next time in the 11th of August with Pat Corbett and John Gordon. But finally, I'd like to ask you all to put your hands together and give a very warm round of applause for Helen Boden and Elizabeth Rimmer. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Please unmute yourself.
Magic.
Thanks for listening. Hope the meeting goes all right, Nori.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. See you next time.
Thanks. Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.